Hello, I'm Margaret MacMillan. When I got word that I was going to do the Massey Lecture, I had a great deal of trouble in deciding on a subject. But I finally decided that what I wanted to do was talk about history and people. Because it seems to me that without the individuals in history, history is much less interesting, but we're also missing something very important because people do matter. I think history has to be fun. I think history is important, but I think it also should be entertaining, it should engage people. I mean, look, if you like gossip, it's much better to read history than Hello magazine because you're going to get an awful lot more interesting people. I've spoken to audiences across Canada about characters in history, but this series is something new. We're putting leaders under the microscope and exploring what characteristics steered them right and wrong. Welcome to the Art of Leading. Chapter 1. Is history any use? Historians have tended to swing away from talking about people in history. There's been talk about the dead white men theory of history and how it really isn't the way to explain history. But I think we're moving back to recognizing that it's a balance. In history, we go through fashion just like everyone else. And in the 19th century, there was a view that history was made by powerful people, usually men. And there was a reaction against that, a very understandable reaction. People said, look, no, it's not. It's made by forces, it's made by economic forces, it's made by technological forces, it's made by all sorts of things, but individuals don't matter. And so people talked rather contemptuously about the dead white man theory as that old-fashioned sort of history. And I think we're swinging back a bit and saying, look, maybe it's a matter of both. Maybe individuals at certain times really matter. And it doesn't have to be men. Margaret Thatcher, Indira Gandhi, Catherine the Great, they left their mark on history. So what we're trying to do, I think, always as historians, is balance between what I would call the impersonal forces of history, the great currents flowing through the past and through the world, and those individuals who at certain points are in positions to make decisions and make those decisions and change the way in which things are going. I mean, think of 20th century history without Hitler, without Stalin, without Winston Churchill. It would have been a very different history. This is not a how-to guide on how to become a great leader, because I don't think myself that leadership can be taught. I think some people are born with innate abilities and others just don't have it. My own view is that history doesn't give us clear answers and it doesn't give us clear prescriptions for the future. It's not going to give you a blueprint about how to behave. What history does is act like warning signs on highways. Be careful when you're going over a bridge in winter because you might slip. Be careful when you invade someone else's country because they may not like it. I mean, I think history can give us very useful parallels and help us to ask questions.
American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq.
I think when you look back at the US and British invasion and occupation of Iraq, you can see that perhaps the people who planned it were not asking enough questions, not familiar enough with the history. Well, as the invasion and occupation of Iraq was being planned in 2002 and the beginning of 2003, there were a number of people who said to the military planners, look, you're going to need to know something about Iraq. You need to know something about the different forces there, the way in which the country is divided up and balanced among different ethnicities and different religions and different tribes. And a spokesman in the White House said, we don't know who it is, but we suspect it was perhaps the president's spokesman, Karl Rove, said to the assembled press, we don't need to worry about history. You people can write it later. We just go out and create facts on the ground. Well, what happened in the case of Iraq is they were going to learn they did need to know about the history. And I think it's very telling that when the occupation began to run into trouble, the top military, both British and American, sent back for copies of T.E. Lawrence's 7 Pillars of Wisdom, which talked about the Arab world at the end of the First World War, because I think they recognized there was something to be learned from the history. Look, if we ignore history, we're depriving ourselves of a useful tool. And so if we say we don't want to know about the past history of a country we're dealing with, we don't want to know about the past history of a dispute, we're cutting ourselves off from very useful information. We're living in a very difficult and complicated time, and I think we're all realizing that we face a number of challenges collectively on the earth, from climate change to political turmoil to the spread of international terrorism, and I think we need all the help we can get, and history is one sort of help. Thanks for watching. To view the next video in the Art of Leading series, just click here. Go on, it's good stuff. He overdoes it, and she said, I feel like I've been licked all over by a cat.